where we left off the other day was we really kind of just had baked our normal maps down, right? Particularly using the text tools add-on. It's a free add-on. You just have to search for it. Remember, it's in the videos I showed. And then we just kind of briefly showed how to kind of plug in your nodes in your shading menu, right? There's a shading workspace that kind of shows you your materials themselves. They're right here, right? You can kind of pick your different materials there. You can give them names. You can make a new material. You just need to make sure to select an object. And the nice thing is when you select an object, it'll actually show you which material's on there. And really, you can see we just kind of made those normal maps, made sure to kind of create the nodes for those normal maps, and then just plugged in the normal map controller, right? Because that's useful for telling the normal map to go on even better. And you can control strength, right? You can control the intensity of the normal map. So those are quite useful. But that also brings us to what a material is, right? And we've got a couple of materials on these we've already created, right? Like I said, you can always create a new material here. You can always create a new material from the little kind of red ball right here as well, right? There's a new material button there. But really, you just select your object, and you can just click new material. Or just take the material that's already there. Usually there's kind of a default material and everything. You can rename it. And then go to the second object and make a new material. And then name that, right? Naming them always is good because then you can look at them and go, oh yeah, that's that material. That belongs to that one, right? So setting up new materials is pretty easy. You don't even have to be in the shading menu to do it, right? You can actually do it from any menu because we always have our properties menu up here, right? And there's always kind of that little kind of red, reddish ball right here, right? It's almost like a salmon color, really. That ball towards the bottom, there's kind of two red ones here, the checkerboard and then the kind of ball. The ball is your material, right? And what these do is they actually control how your camera, right, the actual viewport sees your model, what kind of color it has, if there's metallic on it, if it's, if there's going to be transparency, you have to kind of set up transmission and kind of do a blend modes here to get the transparency maps working properly. We're just not going to see those, unfortunately. There's just not enough time for this class. But all of these right here are different kinds of properties. Our normal map is plugged into this one, right? If we open that triangle up, you can see there's all the normal map controls. If we want to do glows, we could do that right here. That's something I'm going to save for like the Modeling B course, hard surface modeling, because that's going to give us a lot of cool stuff that we can control for glows. But obviously, this guy's not just going to have glow. It's better for like science fiction stuff and vehicles and things like that. But there's a lot of controls in here for different properties, right? So you don't even have to plug in a texture map to control these, but you can, right? What that allows you to do is control the texture at the level of pixels, right? If I was to just, select just the body, and I'll turn the biped gear off, right? Remember, Shift-I will do isolate select for those, but also you have your eyeliner here, so you can always just turn the eyeball off for an object. But you'll notice that you can actually control these just through properties. If I wanted my guy to be metallic, I just turn up metallic, right? And if I turn down roughness, it becomes a shinier metal or a brushed metal. So I've got Silver Surfer now, right? Now obviously I don't want this guy to be metallic, but you see how you can actually control these just through sliders. But the thing is, you can also plug in an actual texture. See these little kind of dots? And you see I'm kind of on the blue, or the red ball here. Now, in this case, I don't need to be in the shading menu anymore because I don't really need access to these. So I can go to Texture Pane if I want to, right? So we've seen, sculpting, modeling workspace, sculpting workspace, UV editing workspace. There is one dedicated to texture painting. And you'll notice that you can actually go in here and, of course, left-click drag on the bars here to make your viewports bigger or smaller. We don't really need to do a lot of 2D painting, so I'd rather have my real estate for 3D painting kind of bigger. But you'll notice you can do 2D painting just by painting in here. You do need to make sure that the paint is on here instead of view. And you'll see that you have a lot of the same brush controls up here, right? So you see how you don't have as many sculpt tools, but you do have paint, draw, you have soften, you have smear, you have clone, you have fill, and you have some mask features. And pretty much a lot of the same strokes and controls are all here, right? So believe it or not, most of the stuff, some of the stuff we saw with strokes and texture painting on sculpting works identically for color painting. So some of these things you're already somewhat familiar with from our previous lectures. In this case, though, we also want to make sure that our actual display types are on here, right? Remember, there's wireframe here, there's shaded, and then there's that third one that kind of looks a lot like the kind of reddish ball down here. Kind of looks like it's a checkerboard, a small part of a checkerboard wrapped around a ball. That's up here as well. That turns on your viewport, right? Basically, it's using Eevee. In fact, if I go down to the box, it's like the second one down of the modifier, the properties menus, right? There's the wrench screwdriver, which is your brush controls. And this is important because this will make it easier to kind of select between our textures for painting. The second one down, though, kind of looks like a microwave briefcase, right? It kind of looks a little like a microwave, but it looks like it's got a handle on top, so I always call it the microwave briefcase. By default, your rendering engine is set to Eevee. And usually that's kind of what this is anyways. It's your viewport shading, whereas that's your solid shading. That's your material preview, which shows you your textures, your materials. Basically, this third one here, this third ball, is showing you Eevee. So now you can see your normal maps on there looking good, right? And Eevee's on. Of course, you can switch it to cycles to do rendering, and we'll kind of talk about that next week. You turn bloom on to get glows to look better and metal shininess to look better. It kind of catches the light better. Bloom is when your pixels get so saturated that they get really bright. So that actually helps to make the metals look shinier, particularly with light hitting it. And it actually helps to make your glows look a bit better too. So bloom is kind of neat. We're not going to really see it that much on this model, at least not today, right? So just wanted to kind of point out, hey, we want to go to Texture Paint Workspace. You have some basic painting controls here, and then a lot of this stuff is the same stuff from before. Brush is much simpler. You don't have nearly as many of the controls as you do for your sculpting brushes, but texture mask, stroke are all the same basically, right? So you have view plane and stencil, strokes, you still have all your standard strokes. All right. I'm not even going to get into those so much today because I just want to show you guys how to create a color map plugged in on a model and then do some basic painting with it, right? So in Texture Paint Workspace, remember we want to go to kind of our properties here, and in this case I just made sure that this body was selected and I just turned the eyeball off for biped gear, right? But I'm going to go down, right? We have all of our properties tabs here. Towards the very bottom we have these two kind of reddish ones, right? One looks like a checkerboard. That's for loading in a new texture from outside or creating a new texture, although that's not the only way to do it. Right above that is kind of the circle, right? The sphere, the ball that kind of looks like it's got a part of checkerboard in it. So it's that second one up from the bottom. This brings up the biped body because that's the material that's on the object selected, and you can see it's here selected. But you see down here we have all of our material properties we can plug stuff into. So what we could do is we can click on these dots. You see when we actually have these dots, some of them are yellow, some of them are gray, some of them are like a purplish blue, right? Most of them are gray, some of them are yellow. These dots, though, let you click, and they're in the front of it, right? There's these smaller dots that are all kind of light gray. That's not what we want for this, right? We want the ones that are much bigger dots that have different colors. They're right in the front. So if I click on this yellow dot right next to the word base color, because this is our color, right? I click on that, and it brings these options up, right? Now that means there's lots of different things you can plug in here. But I want to go to the texture column, right? There's a texture column. And you'll see there's one called image texture, because that's what our texture map is going to be. It's an image, right? Like we said, you click on that yellow dot, and right next to base color right here for your material, you move over to the texture column, image texture. And what that does is that actually plugs in a texture here. Now you'll notice there's two options now, right? Because now you see how there's more stuff in the base color. There's that little triangle now, like the normal map has. There's open. So if for whatever reason you had a map that you were working on say, different software and you wanted to bring it into Blender, you would click on open. And that would take you to a normal browser where you can just go find wherever you have that image saved at. In this case, though, I want to create a new one. So see how there is the ability to create a new one from right here. So I click on New, and that brings this up. Now I'm going to call this Body Color, or Biped Body Color. There we go. Give it a name. You also want to tell it your width and height, your amount of pixels. By default, it's set to 1024. That's 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels. I feel like we could go a little higher than that. Blender doesn't really have presets for this, but double it, right? So usually the kind of the ratios for this are like 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048, 4096 by 4096. So just times it by 2, double it, right? So in this case, I'm going to go with 2048. And then I'll do the same thing here. And it should be square, right? Generally, you want these things to be square. You can pick a base color, right? See how color set to black, so I'll click on color here. And he's kind of a trollish guy, so maybe I'll go with like a greenish color, right? Let's go like a green. You see how you can kind of turn up the brightness of the color, as well as then pick it, right? Because if it's black, you have to turn this up to get other colors. And then you can kind of pick whatever color you want. There we go. And we do want it to be blank, right? Because that's going to give us just our regular color. You can do a UV grid from here, right? That checker map thing that Text Tools automates for us a little bit. Technically, you just create a color map and just tell it to be UV grid, right? So it's not that hard to do it manually without Text Tools to provide you with a distortion grid. But the default blank is what we want. Now, if you really wanted a higher quality texture, you could turn on 32-bit floating point. That means each channel, red, green, blue, right, RGB, plus alpha, all gets 32 bits of information for each channel. That does make the texture quality higher in terms of it'll have a smoother transition between colors, right? It also is going to be a bigger file size, though. So for us, we're going to leave that off and just kind of use the default 8-bit. It'll look good enough, but also it'll be just a smaller file size, right? We have devices we're using here that aren't necessarily ridiculously powerful. But basically, we just click on that yellow dot. We go to the image texture option, right? It's one of the little kind of options that pops up there. Once we've done that, we click on it'll have this stuff here. Click on New, and then you give it a name. Tell it to be 2048 by 2048. Pick a color. Hit OK. And there's our color map. Right now we've got some color on this model. Now, a couple of things to be aware of with this. One, maybe this is a little shiny for me. So we're already right in here. I could always just scroll down a little bit, right? Your scroll wheel will work for this, but there's a little slider bar on the side. I can go down and I can turn my specularity down a little bit. Specular means shininess. And I can also turn the roughness up, right? See how roughness makes something shiny less or more shiny, right? So you turn specularity down, but you can also turn roughness up to get your specularity really, really subtle. But that's shininess, right? Specular generally means shininess. Metallic is part of that, but also it does something very specific with how the highlight colors work to actually give it a proper, more metallic look. All right, so I can turn that down a little bit. And you see I've got a color map plugged in here now. Map's right there. And if I go back up to the very top of my properties menus here, right, there is this little wrench and screwdriver. You will see the color map here eventually. Right now we don't see it because even though it's on the model, it's not really the active map. So this is where I kind of go over to here, right? And once again, you'll see kind of in our 2D painting space, you'll see this, right? And right now it's showing the normal map. Now, right next to that is that kind of triangle dot one. It kind of is like a simplistic landscape picture. It's not the name here, but this little kind of pull-down menu right next to it. It's got a little V pointing down. Click on that. There's your body color. Now, it hasn't been saved yet, so right next to that is image. And what we could do is we can go to save, and I'll do save as just to give it a proper name. Body color PNG should work fine. And you see it's just doing a default color bit, 8-bit color depth. You see how there are other types besides PNG formats, but PNG should be fine. I'll save image. There we go. And now you'll see once you've kind of got it made sure to be it's the active one here, and you make sure to save it because it's been created, but it hasn't been saved yet as an external file. These textures are separate PNG files. That's its own file. It just happens to be plugged into Blender. A cool option for Blender, though, too, is to go File, External Data, and check on Automatically Pack into Blender File. What that'll do is it'll automatically pack in your normal maps and whatever color maps you've got on your model into that Blender file. So all you have to do is take that Blender file. The Blender file will become bigger because it's got textures in it as well, but those textures are actually in the Blender file now, which is really, really cool. It's a neat feature that Blender has. So now if I was to just go save as for the whole, model scene, I could just call this, texture map. So I'll call this texture. There we go. And now it's saved. And now you'll see once we kind of make sure that image is the right one activated, that it's saved, you'll see that we actually get to see inside of the very top properties one, right? The wrench screwdriver one, the very top. It's kind of a light gray one. You'll now see that we have our normal map available, but also our color map. And you see how we could switch between those for active texture? And we want the color map. Now, you'll notice that we, of course, have our draw brush on. And you'll notice that our symmetry's on up here. Right? See how I've got the X on? I have found that if you have overlapping UVs like we do, where the UVs were kind of just mirrored over and are on top of each other, that for texture painting, that can do some weird stuff. Since those UVs are already on top of each other, the same texture is going to go on both sides of the model. So we don't need symmetry off. I feel like it gets in a conflict sometimes. So I actually, for sculpting, you want it on. But for texture painting, if you have overlapping UVs, you want it off. All right. So just a few of those little things right there. And we're going to review this stuff, and you're going to see me do it a couple more times on a few other objects. Now I want there to be a little bit of simple color variation with this, right? So I'm simply just going to go to kind of pick the color here, right? And it's right here as well. So you can pick your color there, but you can also scroll down here and pick your color here, right? Particularly if you have the wrench screwdriver on. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do kind of a lighter green, right? A lighter green. I've just got my regular draw brush on. I usually also go to fall off over here. It's right next to stroke, and I go to the pull down menu and I pick smoother. This kind of has a softer edge. And what I could do is I can now go in here and I could paint that. And you can see how it's actually a little bit too light green, so undo. Probably turn it down a little bit. And it's not green enough also. There we go. There we go, that's better. And you'll see I can go in here and I can just left click drag paint with that draw brush to start to paint color on here. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about getting kind of some color variation on this mesh, right? Now, I often nowadays will just go with a full 100% one strength for this paint, because then what it'll do is it'll give us a really clean, even paint here. And then we can always kind of feather the stuff later on that we don't want to paint. So I can paint that a little bit more. There we go. Maybe do a little bit around the eyes as well. There we go. And then maybe a little bit in the ear here as well. So just getting kind of a little bit of core, simple painting. And you see how this is just left mouse drag, right? So the draw brush is already on by default. I just made sure to pick a lighter variation of that green, and I'm just left dragging to paint color on this mesh, right? And of course, I could go in here for the arm. If you want, I also have found that remember there's a little V for these display types here. If I click on that, you can turn off world space lighting. What that does is it kind of keeps it well lit from your camera, so you can kind of see the model better when you're painting. And of course, I could go in here and I could do a little bit of color painting on the arm. I'll show you the mask stuff later on. But I just wanted to get us some kind of default color painting on this model to start off with. So we just get in here and just kind of get some color paint on there. There we go. Be careful, right? Because if you paint like right along here, you see how it doesn't handle that edge well? That's because those normal directions are facing away from the camera. So when you're painting, it doesn't really know how to handle that as well. So when you get to edges where the polygons are facing away from the camera, the color that it's projecting from the brush, it's going to kind of like glaze it or graze it, right? Kind of like a glancing shot. So you do have to be a little careful with that stuff. And of course, your brush size works the same way, right? Left and right brackets, or S, left mouse button, or the radius control right there. I just come in here and kind of paint a little more color there. Paint a little more color there. Maybe a little bit more here. There we go. Now what I do is I actually like to kind of soften the edges a little bit. Now, if you have a nice Wacom tablet, you can get pressure sensitivity. But in this case, I'm just using a mouse. So I'm going to turn the strength down. I'm going to keep that exact same color, but I'm going to turn the strength of the brush down a lot. And then you see what it allows me to do is go to the edges. You see how I can kind of subtly paint in. Less gray, but you see how it kind of creates a better fade transition for this? So what I do is I just kind of go lay in a base color variation at 100% strength 1. And then I can go in with a lower strength later on along the edges to kind of give it a nice little kind of, it's a more gradual transition from one color to another. Rarely do you have a hard transition like that. Sometimes you do, but rarely. So this could be a great way to kind of get a quick base color on the model, but then also just kind of do a nice little bit of kind of fading, right? Kind of provide a nicer, cleaner, more subtle transition to the rest of the model. And that's just the same color. I just turn down the strength of the brush, right? I just turn down the strength of the brush. And this starts to give us a nice bit of kind of color variation here and a kind of more natural fade into the rest of the model around it. And you see it just adds that little extra kind of believability and realism. Looks like we can get in here and kind of do a little bit on the sides by the fingers here. And this is just some of the kind of neat stuff you could do with this as you're painting to just give you a little bit of that nice extra variation. And this is a big part of what I'm looking for if you're in projects. I'm going to show you guys, of course, more over the next couple days. And I'd love you guys to be able to do more of that. But if you don't, and you just get some basic coloring like this, this will still be good, right? It'll still show me you're kind of getting the basics of how to work with a color map. There we go. And that should get us something halfway decent for the base color for that. Now, keep in mind that you'll see how this is actually a 2D painting here. You see how that's actually painting right on the model into your actual 2D PNG. You see how those UVs are kind of telling it where to go? Now you'll notice that the image up here that I showed earlier for saving, that's got an asterisk next to it. That means this image needs to be saved. So I go to Image, Save. There we go. And then of course I can just hit Control S for regular Blender scene file save. And now you've got that fully saved. The image is saved, the Blender scene file is saved, and of course that's got the external data automatically packed in a Blender file with it. And that's how you can do core color map painting. All right, that'll be a great place to stop.